Guten Abend, allemaal, und seid begrüßt zu die Kadima. Und einen schönen Dank noch einmal zu unserer jiddischen Diva Karen Feldman für ihre fantastische Musik. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's online event, our second in our spontaneous winter lockdown sessions of Yiddishkeit Open Ekran. My name is Faye Burston, and I'm the cultural producer of the Kadima, Australia's home of Yiddish language and culture. And huge thanks to one of our resident Yiddish divas, Karen Feldman, for her beautiful music that we were just listening to once again. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Kadima stands today with a Yiddish acknowledgement of country. Wir alle kennen die traditionelle Oppeter von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint, das Bunmerang-Volk von dem Kulin-Volk, und wir geben Abkaved seine Eltern von Amol, von heint und von der Zukunft. We are thrilled to welcome back tonight our very special guest, Professor Dovid Katz, live from his current location in the UK, in part 2 of our spontaneous lockdown programming. Dovid is one of the world's leading Yiddish scholars and Holocaust history advocates. He is a prolific author, a fearless critic of historical revisionists, and a passionate educator who founded Yiddish studies at Oxford and then again later at Vilna. We're not giving Zoom lectures around the globe. He is currently hard at work on his new Yiddish cultural dictionary and editing the journal defendinghistory.com. Like we did a couple of weeks ago, Dovid will give us a brief lecture and then open up to questions. Please pop your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, and we'll get to them in order. Taref Reint, please welcome Dovid Katz.
Good evening, Melbourne. Thank you, Faye. Wonderful to be with you again. I begin again by remembering my unforgettable visit to Kadima 10 years ago when I was able to hear every living Yiddish dialect from survivors for whom Kadima was a second home, a place to meet, to read, to discuss, and to argue. Now, the topic of dialects and dialectology is very universal. Every living language is always changing. It never stays the same. And when two communities are a little bit separate by a river, by a mountain, separated by religion, by culture, their languages, their way of talking begins to differ one from the other, and that we call dialect. So dialects are a universal. They're so universal that some linguists think it's native. It's part of the innate ideas of the brain to cope with variety in language, even as humans are uniquely to cope with language per se. We also know that dialects are very explosive socially, politically. We associate people with the way they speak. We associate people with the history they've had. Australian English, South African English, American English, and other forms of English that were separated in some degree from other forms, went their own ways, and we have our associations. Now, coming to Yiddish, one of the magnificent things about Yiddish for dialectologists is that Yiddish was almost never in power. If we discard that little brief and ultimately minor and disastrous Soviet experiment, Yiddish has thrived in many languages and centuries, been very creative, without ever having an academy, a government, a police force, a navy, an army to enforce education or grammar or spelling or pronunciation or anything else. So Yiddish is in a way language gone free, but in a very sophisticated book-centered civilization, as we saw last time, one that had 3 Jewish languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, but only Yiddish as the spoken language. In recent times, in very recent times, with the disappearance of the last survivors of pre-Holocaust Eastern Europe, and we cherish everyone we still have, God willing, to the proverbial 120 years, we come to the question of the Yiddish of today and tomorrow. Do we want just a standard Yiddish from some courses or textbooks? Do we want to preserve the living dialects? So let's try to get into it a little bit. I will try to share the screen, and if I succeed, we'll be halfway there. Can everybody see? Faye, is this working?
Yes, it is, Dovid. Go ahead.
It is. Okay, so welcome everyone. Now, we started last time with the map of medieval Europe, the Sephardim in the Iberian Peninsula, the Canaanim way to the east in the Slavic countries. And right in the middle, you see here in this orangey color, I can make it a little bigger for while we're looking at it, Ashkenaz. So all Yiddish speakers, native Yiddish speakers, traditional Yiddish speakers derive from the Ashkenazim, the medieval Jews in the Germanic-speaking lands of Central Europe, Ashkenaz and the Ashkenazim. Now, Old Ashkenaz was divided into two main Yiddish dialects that are today totally forgotten, but that you need to know about if you're going to understand medieval Ashkenazic rabbinic literature. There was a western part by the river Rhine known as the B'nai Hess, and there was an eastern part in the Danube region known as the B'nai Ches. It took a long time for scholars to figure out that this was all about Yiddish dialect and language. The two main figures are the Maharil and Iserlin. The Maharil, who lived from roughly 1360 to 1427, Jacob Molin, but we, in the world of Judaica, remember rabbis by their traditional names, the Maharil, his acronym. Well, the Maharil was talking about the laws of how to tie the tefillin, the traditional phylacteries. And I think we have here an actual, for those of you who read Rabbinic Hebrew, that's the original printed version, but I'll give you the translation here. The children of Austria and all the regions of the B'nai Ches, or the children of Ches, position the Ma'abarto, that is that little passageway in the tefillin, in the phylacteries, toward the hand. And we, the children of the Rhine, and all the B'nai Hess, the children of Hess, position the opening toward the body. In other words, this is very important stuff in this culture of laws from Sinai and how to don the traditional phylacteries. And there's a difference between the B'nai Hess and the B'nai Ches. Another famous example came a little bit later in the days of Iserlin, Yisroel ben Pesachia, who lived from around 1390 to 1460. He was writing about the traditions of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when it falls on a Monday and there's a new moon, and what blessing to say first, if there's a Sabbath involved. And anyway, he goes into a long discourse of, I want to take the credit for fulfilling this commandment on the day of, before the day of judgment is over. And the rabbis of the B'nai Ches did this also, but the B'nai Rinus, the B'nai Ches, did not want to bless the new moon before Yom Kippur, etc., etc., etc. It took hundreds of years, recent hundreds of years, for scholars to figure out this was all about a western part of Ashkenaz where Ches was pronounced like hey. So in modern Yiddish, we probably have only one definite relic from that dialect, meken, the word for erase from the Hebrew word root mochak. Unlike shechten from shohat, there's no ch in meken. It's considered a B'nai Hess relic. The late, great Max Weinreich tried to find about a dozen relics, including, for example, the woman's name, Simeh, that derives from Simcha and became among Ashkenazim the woman's form of Simcha, as opposed to Simcha that stayed the male name. So this had to do with the two dialects of Old Ashkenaz being B'nai Hess around the Rhine and B'nai Hesh around the Danube and Elbe. As usual in dialects, we grab onto one feature, or the rabbis here grabbed onto one feature. They made a name of the people based on it. There's a bit of biblical humor here. You may remember from Genesis, Abraham bought the Moras HaMachpelah, the tombs for his family, from a Hittite who was of the B'nai Ches, meaning the children of the Hittites. And Ches is the name of the letter Ches, which Ashkenazim pronounce like Chaf, Cha, and in the West they just couldn't, and the sound went to Ha, to Hey. So anyway, those are the two primeval dialects of Ashkenaz that are long forgotten. The history of Ashkenaz emerged after that by eastward migration. We spoke about that last time, that Western Europe, Central Europe was sinking in the then intolerance of Christian governments, the Crusades, the Black Death, the massacres, the accusations, the blood libels, and the rise of Eastern Ashkenaz by migration to Eastern Europe. And this resulted in Yiddish spreading to Eastern Europe. Yiddish, of course, comes from the Ashkenazim from Central Europe. And sometime around the 16th century, give or take, these things don't happen overnight, and scholars naturally impose periods on phenomena. These are the Yiddish dialects at the maximal time of Yiddish expansion, around the 16th century, when Yiddish was one of the largest linguistic empires in Europe. You see the old Western dialects, yes, Northwestern Yiddish, Midwestern Yiddish, and Southwestern Yiddish. That's in the west or the left of your screen. And you see the formation of the three East Yiddish dialects. The most populous one, Polish, that's Mid-Eastern Yiddish, the purple area, that eventually also split into a Southeastern Ukrainian area, the light green, and that stood opposed to the Northerners, the Litvaks in blue. So this is the maximal map of Yiddish dialects, 3 in the West, 3 in the East. Now, Western Yiddish is a dead language, but we have to remember that it's a language that gave rise to a very important literature that existed for many hundreds of years. To give a few samples of the old Western Yiddish, Koifenfleisch that we know in modern Yiddish from Standard Yiddish, and Keifenfleisch from Northeastern or Litvish Yiddish, and Koifenfleisch from Polish, Hungarian, Mid-Eastern Yiddish would have been Kafenfleisch with 2 long A's there. A girl was not Mädel but Pilzel. Father was not Tate but Ete. Grandfather was not Zede but Harle. Grandmother was not Bobbe but Chale. Chale, the Sabbath bread, was Berchis or Barchis, a word that still survives in certain dialects of Hungarian Yiddish and indeed of the Hungarian language, originally probably from the Hebrew Birchas or Birchas, blessing of. So the Western Yiddish dialects were doomed to die out. That death was helped in the 18th century greatly. It was sped up by the Berlin Maskilim, the Enlightenment movement, to stamp out Yiddish that succeeded in the West to turn older Western Ashkenazim into German Jews. And they lost their Ashkenazic ethnicity, while we in the East had that ethnicity flourishing. Dialectology is always fascinating. Older rabbinic scholars had to deal with it when it came to issues of Jewish law. Well, I mentioned the Maharil. The same Maharil wrote also about how to write the name of the river Danube in a writ of divorce. Should it be Donau or Donai? And he goes into a long discourse of how the children of Austria have it one way and those of the city Regensburg have it another way. And he concludes saying, well, the language of Regensburg is more prestigious, more correct. Let's spell it that way. So you have standards emerging even without a government. Isserlin, another very great rabbi, He lived a little later. He wrote about in this 15th century, Isolin, and in the in the late 15th century, sorry, Isolin wrote about how to write names in the writs of divorce. In Jewish law, a divorce, even more than a marriage certificate, has to have the names of the parties the way they're called in everyday life, and there has to be a standard spelling. So Isolin got into a lot of detail about the name Michal, how it should be spelled, and then he goes into Yiddish. In other words, Yiddish dialectology was part of rabbinic culture, and the rabbis were the intellectual classes, the writers, the thinkers, the philosophers, the grammarians, and of course, the lawyers. Now, there are many cases where language came into it beyond divorce. It came into it in testimony of witnesses. So you have rabbis writing about the dialects of Yiddish for many hundreds of years. As in the history of Yiddish literature, you have that one amazing 16th century personality, Elijah Levita, number 2 here on your slide, Elia Bocha. We know him as the author of Bova D'Antona, the original Bova book, the first Yiddish literary masterpiece, arguably. In various of his dictionaries of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, he goes into the difference in pronunciations of Yiddish and indeed of the co-territorial Ashkenazic Hebrew. And we have reason to believe it was he who cracked the meaning of B'nai Hes and B'nai Ches in older rabbinic writings that were forgotten by the 16th century. Third, you had Christian scholars. From the early 16th century onward, we have a huge literature about Yiddish by Christian scholars. There were the humanists who studied Yiddish as an adjunct to Hebrew and Aramaic in the spirit of European humanism. There were the commercial handbook writers who are helping people in trades with many Jews, like horse dealers at the time, cattle dealers, to learn the language of their Jewish colleagues. You had criminologists studying the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish in the underworld language, Rotwelsch. You had anti-Semites out to prove that Yiddish is all about cursing the Christians and cheating them in business. So you had all these different schools, plus you had blessed scholars who fell in love with research and scholarly material. So among Christian scholars of Yiddish, Buxtorf, in his 1609 grammar of Yiddish, has a famous one-liner. He says, the Polish Jews sing when they talk, and they say enk instead of eich for the objective form of you, plural. By the mid-18th century, you had the brilliant Chrysander writing in his Yiddish grammar all about differences in Yiddish. In 1784, somebody we know almost nothing about, Carl Wilhelm Friedrich, publishes a dictionary that's full of Yiddish dialectology. He comments on things that now only specialists know, which dialects of Yiddish, when somebody sneezes, say osse, and which say asusse. Those are the two old words. Things like Gesundheit come from modern German, and zugesund are an attempt to Yiddishize it. Traditional Yiddish has osse and asusse, and Friedrich went into it. He made a classification of Yiddish dialects. It fascinated him. But coming to our Eastern Yiddish, anybody who studies Yiddish and goes beyond the standard Yiddish of elementary textbooks comes upon one big difference: Northern versus Southern, otherwise known as Litvish versus Polish, or Lithuanian Belarusian versus Polish, Ukrainian, Galician, or Litvish versus all the rest, because the rest are much more numerous. Now, it's fascinating. Now, this is the North and the South, okay? So here, if we combine the Southern dialects, you see Polish, Ukrainian, and the Romanian Yiddish in the South, and the Lithuanian, Belarusian dialects in the north. Incidentally, the speakers of the South were always at least 75% of all Yiddish speakers. The Litvaks up north were never more than a quarter, and for all kinds of different reasons, that is still true. Now, this diagram is meant to evoke a clock where A replaces B, and then B replaces C, or these are things that are called in linguistics pull chains and push chains, where one sound changes and it ends up changing all the others. Anybody who knows Yiddish at all and has come in touch with dialects knows that a Litvak says zogen and a Polish Jew zugen. A Litvak says kumin, a Polish Jew kimin. Litvak says vine, and the southerner van. It's as if the clock is turned one notch. And the great Yiddish linguist Solomon Birnbaum, Shleimosha Birnbaum, discovered from a detailed manuscript study that U becoming E was the first of these changes that probably caused all the rest. When U became E in certain older dialects of Western Yiddish that became Polish Yiddish, U became E, then there suddenly was no U, and the old O became U. So Kumin became Kimin, and Zogen would have become Zugen that moment or shortly thereafter. And these kinds of chains explain several things. First, how one sound ends up being 10 sounds that are different. But second, that it's all so systematic, it could have been planned by an architect of the language. In fact, many of us have heard stories from our grandparents and great-grandparents when they migrated and heard the other radically different dialect the first time, that first children will laugh hysterically with hilarity. Ha ha ha. He says Kimin and not Kumin, and he says Zogen and not Zogen. I remember at our Passover table in Brooklyn, I had two aunts who absolutely hated each other, and there was the danger of them starting a fight and ruining the Seder. And my father would kick me under the table to get them to laugh hysterically, which I could do by imitating a Polish Yiddish dialect that as a kid I had picked up as imitator from the local Hasidim who were then moving into, and as we saw it, taking over Borough Park. But after the hilarity comes a second recognition that these differences are so systematic that after an hour, everything is more or less intelligible. After I hear Kumin Kimin, I can predict Purim Pirim because it's systematic. It covers virtually or almost all the old words that had that vowel. Of course, that means that there's a proto-language, that these dialects go back to a proto-Yiddish. So I don't know that we want to go into any great detail today, but the northern I is the southern A that's usually long in Poland and short in Ukraine. Gai v'daigis haint and vine, or ga v'daigis hant and van. The E in stressed open syllables very often is lengthened. Betten becomes baten. A in the north is I in the deep Polish and Hungarian accents. Okay, so O is U, Matona is Matunen, Nosen is Nussen, Zogen is Zugen. Oi is O, Afroi is Afro, Aklois is Aklos, Ashoib is Ashob, in some dialects Ashub, Hund is Ahint, and it is all quite systematic. Now, interesting, the borders, if I skip for a moment, this is the map of my own expeditions of the last 30 years, where a great effort went into drawing this blue line. That's the southernmost boundary of Litvish Yiddish, which is by definition the northernmost boundary of all the rest. I was busy going from shtetl to shtetl, finding the last informants alive on either side. Strangely and happily enough, it's quite similar to a dialect we know from the 16 and 1700s, from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and its dialect with the Kingdom of Poland. From Jewish sources, we know it from the councils of the lands, the Va'ad Ba'arotzis, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. You see that border there. The northern part, Va'ad Lito, and the southern part, the other countries that were. So this dialect goes back to two great medieval countries, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And that is the ultimate origin of the kind of geographic separation that leads to different dialects emerging. Again, to remind us, to keep reminding us, the North versus the South. Okay, you can draw the map all kinds of ways, based on the empires of the time, based on the culture where the Jews considered themselves this or that. And of course, in modern Yiddish theater and vaudeville and humor, you have Litvak and Galiciana. Not a very scientific term because the Litvak tends to call all the rest Galiciana. Galicia is something relatively new in Jewish history, became popularized after the Council of the Peace of Vienna of 1815. Part of Galiciana Yiddish is in Polish Yiddish, part is in Ukrainian, but it's in the folklore is what I'm getting at. In the 18th century, we had the vast cultural difference of Hasidim and Misnagdim. The Hasidic movement spread throughout Jewish Eastern Europe, but ran into a brick wall in Lithuania in 1772. We Litvaks, as we are fond of remembering with some humor, put them into Cherem. Interestingly, like all historic divisions, it's a little more complicated when you get close. There were Hasidic groups up north, many of them like Amdor and Lechavich and Slonim, you hardly hear any more about, or they're long gone. Others like Karlin, you only hear about if you're into this kind of thing. Lubavitch, everybody knows about because they've evolved into a major modern movement. So these Lithuanian Hasidim all spoke or speak Litvish Yiddish, and in many ways they are Litvaks, and the people down south consider them to be some kind of Litvaks. In other words, the northerners are Misnagdim or the northern Hasidim, who are much more similar to each other vis-a-vis the other dialect, the southern dialect. So we Litvaks call the Polish and Hungarian Hasidim the emishe Hasidim, the real Hasidim, or Hasidei Chagas, as opposed to Hasidei Chabad. There's a lot of other folklore between the North and the South, as there always is between people of different dialects. One, personality. The Litvak up north is meant to be dry, cold, humorless, obsessed with facts and knowledge, but lacking in feeling and warmth. The Litvak is supposed to be much poorer, living in the poor Lithuanian earth that's only good for potatoes. And the Litvak is supposed to be less believing and more skeptical. Hence that southern phrase, a Litvak lays himself out in length and breadth to find out the truth about something, and the length and breadth is an allusion to a cross, that he has a cross in his heart because he's not as deeply devoutly Orthodox or Jewish as the Southerners. So you have all kinds of stereotypes, but these are the three most famous ones: personality, wealth, and religiosity. In our expeditions of the last 30 years, of course, I concentrated on the Litvak lands because that's my topic, Northeastern Yiddish. But I had to go south of that border to discover the border. And one of my questions south of the border was, what's a Litvak? And I was surprised at all the answers. Some said a misnagid, it's religious. Some said it's from someone who comes deep from Lithuania, Vilna, Kovna, Grodno, Brisk. Many said a Litvak is someone who speaks Litvish Yiddish. But in Ukraine, some said a Litvak, that's a Lubavitcher, because that's the only kind of Litvak they knew. And then many said a Litvak, sehr a schwerer Mensch. It's a very difficult person, okay? Or someone too serious who has no sense of humor, folkloristic meaning. Now, when Yiddish literature came in the 19th century and it rose meteorically, in other words, within a few decades, it went from being nothing, a folk literature, to being a major European literature. Vastly, all of the precursors, Ettinger and Oxenfeld, they were from the South. Mendel-Leffin, the founders of modern literary Yiddish were from Galicia, from Ukraine. They were from the southern dialects. And if we come to the old competition of the classicists, Peretz was, of course, born in the depths of Poland, Zamość, southern Yiddish. Sholem Aleichem was born in the depths of Ukraine, which was historically, my Ukrainian friends will forgive me, the eastern part of the Polish lands. Mendele, who was the supposed Litvak of the three, he moved from his native Kapule in Belarus as a teenager to Kamenets-Podolsk deep in Ukraine and lived most of his life in Odessa. And witnesses, we remembered and wrote that Mendele spoke Ukrainian Yiddish, and in his writings, he codified the strictest form of the Southern grammar of the three genders and the system of accusative and dative that people struggle with so much to this day. In other words, Yiddish literature is a Southern enterprise in its founding, whereas the rise of modern Yiddish scholarship had dominant Northern folks like Ber Borochov, who himself was born in Ukraine, although in Eastern Ukraine near the dialect border of Litvish and Ukrainian. Zolotonish, a little village near Poltava, which was itself Litvish. But anyhow, in his classic essay in 1913 that established modern Yiddish studies, in a book edited by Shin Nigga, who you see on the right, also, these were all Litvaks. Nigga was born in Dukor, east of Minsk. Borochov has the one explosive sentence: for the basis of the orthography, I take the dialect of the district of Vilna. Okay, now what he was talking about was that Vov is U in Standard Yiddish, not E, that Kometz Aleph is O, not U, and in real life, all of those traditional Yiddish letters and vowels are multi-dialectal. They're O to the northerner, U to the southerner. Hence, all the efforts to Latinize Yiddish were doomed to failure. Max Weinreich and Tzemach Shabbat, among the major founders of YIVO in 1925, all Litvaks, and they gave a Litvak bent to it. Now, this Litvak standard pronunciation, what's the truth about it? The truth is that it's a very simple formula that we recognize as Standard Yiddish in pronunciation, that it's Litvish. It's Zogen, not Zugen, Kumin, not Kimin, Pesach, not Pesach, Wein, not Van, minus that A, the non-literary Litvak A, as in Teire for Teure or Bain for Boim, and of course, Stabishdika Loshin, where traditional Litvaks didn't distinguish Sir from Sh, very much like the oldest classic story about dialectology in the book of Judges. The poor Ephraimites couldn't pronounce Shibboleth or Shiboileth and said Siboleth and got themselves killed. So that was perhaps in the biblical introduction to general dialectology. So anyway, except for these Litvish A and S features, Standard Yiddish was based on Litvish. Research has shown that this is hundreds of years old and goes back to Ashkenazic Hebrew. And it goes back to rabbinic debates of at least 400 or 500 years among Ashkenazim to do with very strict laws about reading the Torah and saying the blessings. And so the formula that the rabbis came up with, guess what? It was the same formula for Hebrew as we have for Standard Yiddish. It's like the Litwaks, except for that A. That doesn't mean that all rabbis agreed. You had very famous rabbis like the Maharal of Prague, famous from all the Golem stories, who championed the southern dialects, Polish, Yiddish, and he found by a complicated system of Kabbalah that they are sacred. So there was a diversity of factors and motives. I don't want to say ulterior, I should say subconscious motives. The motives of patriotism. The Maharal of Prague was justifying, codifying what people were doing in his part of the world. Second, you had a certain hidden standard that the northern dialect, Litvish, is more conservative. It didn't undergo that clock of changes, or to u to or, etc., and was therefore closer to the donor languages, to classical Hebrew, to German in the case of Yiddish. So you have that factor. These are just breakdowns of numbers on the eve of the Holocaust. Okay, there's also social, literary, and cultural dialectology. There's written dialects that I won't go into in any extreme form, in any detailed form. I'll just say, in the 1530s and 1540s, the industry of Yiddish mass media, mass publishing got underway. And you quickly had the publishers decide on a very boring, bland, standard language. If grandfather was Zayda in the East and Hala in the West, and they wanted to sell the darn book everywhere, they would go for a Germanic Großvater, for example. In the 17th century, we have all kinds of handbooks that give all three. So this standard Western Yiddish tended to be this rather boring dialect that was a minimalist to be understood everywhere. By the late 16th and 17th century, the Tzenerena, the Lev Tov, the Brandspiegel, the Musa literature, the rabbinic fight back brought a written Yiddish that had many, many more words from Hebrew and Aramaic that had been mostly in spoken Yiddish all along, but were not written, okay? In the 18th century, with the movement to destroy Yiddish, you don't destroy a language overnight. The Berlin Maskilim did it brilliantly. They started to produce prayer books and Bibles and all kinds of other books written in German, not in Yiddish, but using the same Yiddish type font known as Mashkit and the classic Yiddish spelling of ayin being aleph being a or o, and they created this German in Yiddish letters that became a dialect of writing of the Western Ashkenazim. Okay, Hasidic Yiddish brought with it a lot of Kabbalistic influence in Eastern Europe, and in the 19th century, we have the new dialect of Eastern Yiddish that became our Standard Yiddish. And as I mentioned, you had various factors, but Mendele was very important. Mendele didn't found the standard. He didn't create it. He took it from the mid-19th century standard Bible and prayer book translations in Ivritaic that in the mid-19th century, occasionally a bit earlier, were redone in Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania to reflect the modern dialects. So there are the editions many of us have seen from the 19th century, where the Yiddish is not in the traditional Mashkit font, but in square Hebrew letters with full pointing, and that's virtually modern Yiddish. Let me see if we can go smaller again. In the late 19th century, you had the secularists introduce a Germanized dialect. So instead of Nächten for yesterday, they would start to write gestern in socialist and revolutionary publications. Instead of Moil for mouth, they would write Mund, and they Germanized the spelling, introducing the silent ayin where German has en, in the ending en, that Yiddish never had. In the 1920s and 30s, you had a Soviet Yiddish dialect becoming standard by law, vocabulary, dialect, and standard evolving by diktat of the state with a budget for publications, schools, and so forth. In the United States, in the later 20th century, you had a purist dialect that began a new campaign against words of 19th century Germanic origin, and that became the dialect of many Yiddish courses, okay, and many Yiddish teachers in the late 20th, early 21st century. That too is a dialect, Kuckwinkel instead of Standpunkt, Unterwissig instead of Unterbewusstsein, and so on and so forth. In the 21st century, we have the rise of Hasidic Haredi Yiddish on the basis of the southern dialects, basically of Polish Yiddish, if I had to put it in one word. We've just completed a 5-week mini summer course at the Arbeiter Ring online on Hasidic Yiddish publications. All of us, the teachers and participants alike, I think we were surprised that Hasidic Yiddish now has dozens of magazines, hundreds of books, many newspapers, and it is an evolving standard that is changing, but fascinatingly, based on the southern dialects of Polish Yiddish that were always about 75% of Yiddish speaking. So ironically, it's a democratization in that it has demolished the predominance of the Litvak-based standard of the North. Now, Yiddish dialectology, the Yiddish DIALECTOLOGY, is itself a major part of the folklore and the history of modern Yiddish studies. The greatest Yiddish dialectologist of all time was Noach Prilutsky. He was born in Berdichev, grew up in Kremenetz, born in 1882, murdered by the Nazis in 1941, about a year after he fled the Nazi invasion to then Soviet-occupied Vilna, and was one of the first murdered in the summer of 41, when the Holocaust broke out in the Baltics. Now, Noach Prilutsky is an amazing, amazing guy. He was a top lawyer in Warsaw. He was a member of the city council, at times a member of the Polish parliament. He was a leader of Polish Jewry. He was in a delegation that met American President Warren Harding in the early 1920s. He was one of the leaders of the Folkist party, the Folkisten. Now, to modernists, that might sound very similar to all kinds of other socialist Yiddishist parties. But the closer you get, the more different and unique each is from all the others. This same Noach Prilutsky managed to write about a dozen volumes of Yiddish dialectology. His books have names like the Yiddischer Vokalism, the vowels of Yiddish, Dialektologische Parallelen und Bemerkungen, der Yiddischer Konsonantism. Isaac Bashevis Zinger, in his Mein Tatens Bezdinstub, has a wonderful scene where his father, Rabbi Pinchas Mendel Zinger, a rabbinic author and a rabbinic judge, was once swindled out of, I think it was 600 rubles. So what did a poor rabbi do when he was swindled in Warsaw in the 1920s or 1930s? Gegangen to Noach Prilutsky to help him to do something legally. And Prilutsky looked at him and he said, "You are from the district of Lublin originally." "Yes." And the rabbi said, "Yes, how did you know?" And then Prilutsky said, "You're from Tomashov originally." This was the Henry Higgins of Polish Yiddish. Because his books are so difficult, nobody to this day has ever done a book or thesis to bring them to life again. Nobody has done an atlas. I remember when I was a student and undergraduate at Columbia, and my dream was to own a book by Noach Prilutsky. I went with my father to the bookstores on the Lower East Side of New York, and we found Yiddish Consonantism from 1917. We were thrilled. But then when we came home and we started to read the book, my father and I decided after a whole night that we basically didn't understand one word, not to mention that the whole book was about the consonants L, M, and N, which had never figured among the top topics of Yiddish discussion or vital disagreement. My colleague and friend Kalman Weiser in Toronto has written this wonderful book on Prilutsky, the Folkisk. Last time I visited Toronto, I think 2016, and Kalman was introducing me when I met his students. He said, I'm always happy that I didn't listen to Dovid Katz and do a thesis and book on Prilutsky's dialectology, or I would have never finished. So he did his famous book on Prilutsky, the leader of the Folkists of Poland. So if any of you guys is looking for a wonderful thesis topic, it's Noach Prilutsky and to create a Yiddish atlas based on his amazing dozen books. In America, after the Holocaust, an amazing woman, forgotten, I don't know why, Jean Blech Joffen. I couldn't even find her exact years of birth and death. She did something amazing. After the Holocaust, when it was the last thing on anybody's mind, she decided to do a doctorate on Yiddish dialectology. You can easily get the microfilm printout to this day, but you still don't even have that as a nicely printed book. Jean Joffen proved that even after the Holocaust, you can do Yiddish dialectology by observing careful methodology and interviewing informants, making questionnaires. Her maps were all homemade, as you see here, but they are every bit as sophisticated and accurate. And she, of course, inspired the great Uriel Weinreich, who founded the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. Many of its tapes are online. I think if you look it up on the internet under EYDES, EYDES, or LCAAJ, you'll quickly find it. Uriel Weinreich managed in his short life, he wasn't quite 41 when he passed away in 1967, tragically. Among the students he personally inspired to Yiddish dialectology, each went on to do great things. My own late teacher, Michael Herzog, went on to publish the Yiddish language in northern Poland and to direct the atlas for decades, and indeed to publish the first few volumes. The rest is still unpublished. Professor Herzog specialized in phonology and the sound system. My dear friend, Professor Robert D. King, now thriving in his mid-80s in Austin, Texas, went on to bring Yiddish dialectology to the forefront of American linguistics. In his famous book on generative grammar, he brought examples from the Southern Yiddish final devoicing law, how it proves points of general linguistics precisely because of the freedom of Yiddish dialects to develop without government interference. The late Dr. Mordechai Schechter is best known as a lexicographer, an educator, a language normativist, but he was the great Yiddish dialectologist of words, of lexicography. He knew which dialect contributed what word to Yiddish, and his writings are full of materials that could be put together into a wonderful lexicon of words, dictionary, and semantics. I remember as a student, I only knew from my father and from my studies that in Yiddish, the word for a lot or many is asach. But then when I started noticing my elderly uncles who never went to Yiddish school all said afule, and Dr. Schechter was able to immediately tell me that asach came into Standard Yiddish from Ukrainian Yiddish, from the South. We Litvaks say afule. Weinreich's wife, Beatrice Silverman Weinreich, she went into folklore, and her geographic folklore studies show how a folk tale developed in different ways. And Richard Zuckerman, who I hope is doing well in Alsace, he went into Western Yiddish. And one of his great achievements was finding the last traces of Yiddish in Alsace. So each of Uriel Weinreich's pupils went into a different field of Yiddish dialectology. Speaking of Western Yiddish, languages don't die like people. Think about it. As a viable language, Western Yiddish went under in the late 18th, very early 19th century. But even after the Holocaust, Florence Guggenheim Greenberg was able to discover and record the Yiddish of two villages in Switzerland on the German border, ending in Lengnau, not far from Konstanz. The great Hartog Behm was able to write many books on Dutch Yiddish, Netherlandic Yiddish. And perhaps his pupil, my good friend Joel Kahan, is listening today. He was with us last time, and I've mentioned Richard Zuckerman. Okay, today Yiddish dialects are controversial academically on the question of Proto-Yiddish, how much of the Yiddish dialects come from one language. In our world of Yiddish education, we are all facing a painful and bitter reality check concerning the dialect that we know as Standard Yiddish in the face of Hasidic Yiddish. And we come to questions of what does the Yiddish master of tomorrow need to know? Just a standard or a genuine dialect too? And on that note, I'd like to turn it over to questions, and I'll be delighted to do my best.
Hashanah Dank, Dovid. What a great lecture. We have a few questions already. The first is actually from one of unsere. John has asked, with Yiddish being a language that's not spoken in a native fashion, does that mean that there is a responsibility on those of us keeping it alive to look at which particular dialects we are choosing to keep alive?
Wonderful question, John. Thank you. There, as usual, I have two separate answers. If we live in the cocoon, the bubble of our Yiddish classes and courses and clubs and organizations and concerts and Kumsitzes and Zoomsitzes and everything else, we might be living in a closed universe where there is no Hasidic Yiddish, and we have only what's left of our non-native Yiddish. Non-native, not in the sense that all of us are non-native, no, in the sense that we have no streets and cities and settlements that speak it as a native language. And here we come to two opinions within that cocoon. One opinion is, let's keep it simple, Standard Yiddish. It's almost phonetic, Kometz Aleph, O. You don't have to get into that it's O in some words and U in others. And Standard Yiddish is more than enough to appreciate the vast majority of Yiddish literature. You have another opinion that to really know the Yiddish language, you should know at least one dialect, whatever dialect that is. Those are the two opinions in our cocoon. Outside of the cocoon, and the cocoon is beginning to break, we are coming to the realization that there are close to 1 million native Yiddish speakers alive today in Hasidic communities. And some people are shocked, some are not, to discover that a lot of it, an awful lot, is very close to classic Polish Yiddish of Yud Lamed Peretz and Isaac Bashevis Zinger and other great writers. And so is it not necessary to at least have an acquaintance with the native Yiddish of today? What will people think in 100 years if they will find that there was a teacher, professor, professional in Yiddish that didn't even bother with the Yiddish that was being spoken in his or her time? Thank you.
Great. We have an anonymous question.
Anonymous. That sounds exciting.
Was the Yiddish spoken in Brisk the same Yiddish spoken in Bialystok?
No. Bialystok was Litvish Yiddish, very close to the dialect of Vilna and Grodno and Kovna. Of course, those who studied it closely found certain minor differences. For example, the imperative formal plural had the S, kumts, instead of kumt. Usually it's kumt in Northern and Standard Yiddish and kimts with an S in the South, Bialystok. But except for one or two details, Bialystok is part of the North. It's Lithuanian Yiddish. That is not true of Brest, even though the traditional name of the city is Brest-Litovsk or Brisk-de-Liter, even though Brest became home to a great Lithuanian Misnagdim branch of yeshivas and scholars, best known from the Soloveitchik family that originate from Pruzhan or Pruzhin, a town just north of Brisk. Brisk was on the border of Litvish Yiddish and Ukrainian Yiddish. So when we got there in the 1990s, our little team was able to find the last dozen or so native speakers. And when you find a dozen, you can believe that what you have found is basically accurate. It's basically a Ukrainian Yiddish dialect, Kimin and Zugn, but with a lot of Litvish influence, especially of the Litvish A. So you could have Kimin, but Meshin. So Briska Yiddish is one of those magnificent islands of a transitional dialect that became utterly stable within a city that had an area that had tens of thousands of Jews. So Briska Yiddish is a transitional dialect that was more southern than northern.
Okay, great. Olivia asks, was there a clear distinction between southern and northern for those who lived along the border, or did they blend into each other?
The distinction for those who lived along the border was greater than for anyone else. I'd like to mention my dear departed friend, Dr. Hariton Berman, in northwestern, I guess it would be modern Ukraine, passed away about a decade ago, a little more than a decade now. And he was born not far from Rovne, or Rivne today, in northern Ukraine, where the dialect was Ukrainian, but just south of the first towns that begin to speak Litvish. So as a boy growing up in the Rovne, many of the kids in his school and in his high school and his sports team, in his houses of worship, clubs, and so on, came from the towns just to the north of the city, and they spoke Litvish. So he was able to draw me a map of the towns that spoke Litvish and those that spoke Ukrainish or Southern. And that's in our atlas you can find on my website. It's one of the maps there is his map with marked up in his handwriting. Now, one of the reasons that is going to be the answer everywhere is that we're not talking about, even at the Canadian-American border, you find people on both sides well aware of the border and many features. But in the case of Yiddish, it's much more dramatic. If Purim is Purim and Kumen is Kimen and Wein is Wein, and that applies to thousands of words, it is so dramatic that it's one of the first things you notice. So the names were different locally, but if we, looking from outside, apply the neutral words northern and southern, we find that it's a stark difference, and every Jew was a Yiddish dialectologist, the more so if they live near a border.
Okay. Jenny Weissenberg has a question. Dovid, do you know anything about the recent development of Duolingo along the lines of American Hasidic Yiddish?
I've heard of it. I've looked at it. I'm not a specialist. I have not studied it. My own passion in this topic is to discover more and more about real Hasidic Yiddish from real current Hasidim and their speech and their writings. As far as an idea goes, it's naturally part of what's going to happen. What's going to happen, I always like to quip that the past of Yiddish history is difficult, controversial, vexed. The present is always a mess. The future is quite simple, easy. we see 1 million native speakers from the Hasidic community. They are the future of the living Yiddish language. It's only a matter of time before there will be more and more good dictionaries and grammars and internet programs. So without discussing any one program, it's a very welcome development that people are beginning to study the Yiddish of 1 million native speakers and not of our own clubs, as painful as that can be to us.
Mm-hmm. I think you've already answered this. Susan Cohen-Unger asks, how widely is Yiddish spoken as a first language? Is that the same as the 1 million native speakers?
More or less the same. I would only add there are still a few 100,000 very elderly, secular, non-Hasidic speakers of Yiddish, and we wish them all long life and long health, but their children and grandchildren are not raising families in Yiddish or using Yiddish as a language of the family. So those few 100,000 are vitally important. If you live in a community with a 90-year-old, a 95-year-old Yiddish speaker, that person is a treasure. Please tape and video him or her. Ask as many questions as possible. But yes, the Yiddish of the future is not the Yiddish of the handful of secular families that are making a point. It's the Yiddish of traditional Ashkenazic civilization as practiced by today's Haredim who speak Yiddish.
Okay, now there's a couple of questions from Pauline and Leon Orbach. I'm not sure the order of which they've asked them. They ask, assume that much literature was reliant on the dialect used by the author to establish a meter or tzil that gave rise to your quote, Klish Yiddish.
I didn't hear the last part of the question.
They talk about Polish Yiddish sings. Does reading in the original dialect make a difference to how we react to the text?
I suppose the questioner is speaking more about poetry where rhyme is very important. The late Uriel Weinreich did a wonderful study on rhyme in Yiddish culture. The short answer is the vast majority of Yiddish poets of all dialects in our literary secular tradition tried at least in part to rhyme according to standard rhymes. Now, there are many cases where the standard rhyme also works in the dialect, and many cases where it does not. So yes, when you study a Yiddish poet, it's always fun to find the rhymes that don't work in standard Yiddish, where the poet is dipping into his or her native dialect of Yiddish. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Chaim Opperman asks, where do you place the Yiddish of the late Yosef Bulov, Russian Jewish actor? This is Chaim Opperman, was the former head of Yiddish at SBS in Sydney. Thank you, Chaim.
Right. I will use the question to answer a little more generally. Something that I failed to get into in my presentation was that while the Litvish-based standard became the standard for schools in North America and other diaspora countries, it became the official correct Yiddish, even for schools in Poland, where it was not used by the pupils, of course. The Yiddish theater developed a separate standard based on the southeastern variety, the Ukrainian Yiddish variety of Southern Yiddish, Kimin and Zugn, but not Van for Wein. In other words, it was a modified Southeastern Yiddish. It didn't have Southeastern Yiddish localisms like the Totemomelushin of Podolia. It didn't have the A vowels of Volin. It's Southeastern Yiddish, but with that one vowel that Yiddish linguists call vowel 34, Wein or Daige, Meine, Deine, as I rather than. In other words, it was based on the Yiddish of the founders of the Yiddish theater in Romania, the Goldfaden tradition. So in America and in Britain and in Australia in the 1930s, 40s, and beyond, the Yiddish theater would try to adhere to that theater standard. And it sounded very wrong to many Yiddishists when the theater started speaking Litvish, because Litvish was for the school and Southeastern Yiddish for the theater.
Okay. Professor Gilad Zuckerman, hi Gilad, asks, are there any gastronomic traditions that correspond to dialectical differences in isoglosses?
Yes, the most famous academic source is Marvin I. Herzog's The Yiddish Language in Northeastern Poland, where you have dialectological maps for farfel or for the way certain dishes are prepared. In general, there are 3 or 4 such cases. Nobody has proved anything pervasive, but in those cases that are in Professor Herzog's book, they are 100% accurate. That whenever you have 2 populations of a different dialect, it will never be only dialect. We came to Northerners and Southerners before to speak about religion and Hasidim and poverty and questions of personality and all the rest of it. So naturally, if 2 populations were separate enough to go their own ways in language, common sense dictates they went different ways in all kinds of activities of daily life, certainly including cooking and preparing the foods, clothing, and other things, many aspects of which are sadly lost now, because except for those precious few scholars, almost nobody studied it when all the people were around.
Mm. Now, Julia Retz has a couple of questions. She said, asked whether you're going to publish the results of your expeditions, the dialectological maps, and do you select words for your dialectological maps for isoglosses? What's the basic principle?
Right. To answer the second question first, when you set out on a dialectological expedition, you need to construct a questionnaire. So you'll be comparing like for like instead of being all over the place. And to construct the questionnaire, you need to hang around with your informants for a while to begin to hear what's likely to be interesting, not to go in pretending you know nothing. So we made a questionnaire. It's on the web with the atlas that you can find on my website. As for the other question, I only live with my hopes and dreams. I have not been a professional academic since 2010 and have not had time to go through the thousands of pages and more importantly, thousands of hours of tape. And I've certainly made provisions in my will, and I certainly try to digitize and copy when I can. So if I will live to do it, I would love one day to be able to get back to work on the cartography. By the way, the professional maps in the atlas and those that were professional, the ones you saw, were all done by my friend and colleague, Dr. Gedra Betsonita, a professor of cartography at Vilnius University. So I was very lucky to be able to do the 30 maps with her that are in the atlas so far.
Well, thank you. We've got, I think, time for one last question, a very interesting one to end on, from our friend John. In 100 years, will people be studying American and Australian dialects of Yiddish?
The answer is yes, because people will be studying any language and culture that has left cultural products. Melbourne and Australia had many Yiddish writers and produced a lot in the field of Yiddish that will remain no matter what happens, so it will be studied. Whether the dialect will be studied, that's a different question. The short answer is that we don't know, but it's likely that dialects will be studied only if they continue. So we're going to end up at the question of, are there any Yiddish-speaking Hasidim in Australia? And if so, will they multiply to the point of secure existence and separate dialect in 100 years? That we don't know. We can be confident of the situation in America and Israel, even in London, where you have a compact Yiddish settlement that is producing tens of thousands of new speakers all the time. So it's an indirect, the dialect question will depend on the native language question.
Okay. Let's hope we do.
Absolutely.
All right. I think that's it for us. Dovid, thank you once again for a fascinating lecture and to keep us company in lockdown with your wonderful talk. And with that, Ashanim Dank.
Be well. Thank you very much.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.